Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Lowell, and this is your first lesson or your first assignment after spring break. Hopefully, you guys are keeping up on things and having fun. Today, we're going to introduce the Antebellum period, which is the period before the Civil War in America. We're looking at Google Classroom here. This is the assignment. It is a slideshow. And then some responses that you have to write to that. So usually when we start a new topic, I introduce it through slides, and you guys take notes. In this assignment, you're not taking notes. You are viewing this presentation, and then you will be answering some chunk questions on each of these key ideas. So I'm going to go through, I'm posting this video of me going through the slideshow, but you can certainly look at the slideshow on your own. When you do look at the slideshow, I just want to show you guys here how it's set up. As soon as it pops up, it has an essential question, it has topics, it has lots of images like I usually do. Underneath each of these, you can see there are notes at the bottom. So you can go back and look at these and kind of use these notes to help you answer some of the questions. At the end of each section is our chunk where we answer some key critical questions. And you do that for several topics. Going back to Google Classroom, this is the document you have to work on. So if you pull open this document, and these are the same questions that are in the chunk, but you'll need to make a copy of this, write your responses to these, and then turn it into Google Classroom. There's a due date. It is due the day after it is assigned. So pay attention to the due dates and pay attention to when things are assigned. And that's the assignment. So let's go ahead right now and I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. There will be two parts to this presentation because I'm only allowed to screencast for like 15 minutes at a time. So I am going to probably do a part 1 and a part 2. Oh, that's not where we want to be. So our topic is called the Antebellum period. Please say that word with me, antebellum. It's the period before the Civil War. It's about a 10 to 15 year period before the Civil War happens in America. Our essential question is what people, events, and issues caused America to divide as a nation into North and South? So through this slideshow, we're going to be introduced to new people, events, and issues that really caused America to divide into two sections, North and South, and fight the war we call the Civil War. Our first topic is growing tensions between the North and South. And I want you guys to remember the antebellum period is a time period before the Civil War. It's roughly 1845 to 1860. And in this period, the North and South were geographically, economically, socially, and politically divided on many issues, including slavery. As America moved west, though, those divisions intensified. So we're going to talk a little bit about how is the North and South, how are they different, what do they argue over, and how is the expansion moving west kind of caused the tension to rise between these two sections. First, we have to understand the North. The Northern economy was based on industry and manufacturing. This is where people worked in factories, people and machines working together to make products, large warehouses dominating the landscape of many cities. And this is where they took raw materials and manufactured products that would be sold both in America and globally in Europe. The North, one important thing to understand about the North is it had a much larger population than the South. There were more than twice as many people in the North than there were in the South. And the northern population was made up of a lot of immigrants as well. Many people immigrating to the United States from Ireland, Germany, and Sweden, who are populating these large cities and working in these factories. The Southern economy was, of course, based on agriculture and farming. And of course, if we studied, it was completely dependent on slave labor, the growing of cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, and other products. A large part of the southern population were slaves. So it's a completely different place. The work that people do, the interactions that people have, the type of people who do the work is completely different. So the North and South are very, very much different places. Before the Civil War, we've looked at maps like this before. You had what were called the free and the slave states. And as we can obviously see here in the decade before the Civil War, the map shows the political divisions between slavery. So free states are in the north and in the west coast, as you can see here. We have the southern states are where slavery exists, and then in the west we have these territories that aren't yet states. But what it says here is, it says at the bottom, it says territories open to slavery. My cursor, sorry, the thing's in the way. But this kind of tan areas, territories open to slavery, and what that really meant was that people who lived in those territories could vote and decide whether or not they wanted slavery as a territory. Now, what happened in 1850 was that California became a state. It was admitted to the Union as a free state, as you can see right here. And one of the issues that complicated the politics at the time was the admission of California as a free state. This made more free states than slave states. Now, why does that matter? Well, that would upset the balance of power in Congress. Specifically, non-slave states could be outvoted by uh, slave states could be outvoted by non-slave states. So this is really going to upset the South. The South is going to be very upset about the admission of California. So the South, many Southern leaders were willing or threatening to break away from the United States. To avert this or delay the Civil War, a deal was struck. They call it the Compromise of 1850. It basically said, okay, California will come in as a free state. That's a win for the North, but the South gets a really strong slave law. They called it the Fugitive Slave Act, and it basically would help slave owners recapture their runaway slaves. So this deal, kind of brokered between the North and South in Congress, kind of averted or delayed the Civil War. At the same time, this Fugitive Slave Act, as it was called, was a law that helped recapture runaway slaves. More importantly, it made helping a slave a crime nationally. People who helped slaves run away or helped them escape or harbored them could face penalties such as imprisonment or being fined. And the law was really designed to help slave owners capture or recapture their runaway slaves. So prior to this, with the Underground Railroad, as we studied, people made their way to the north to these free states where they were all of a sudden free. But now, under this law, regardless of where they went, they could be brought back to slavery and brought back to their plantations. Okay, so for our first chunk, there are two critical questions here I want you guys to answer in the document that's on Google Classroom. First question, how were the North and South divided in the antebellum period, and how did compromise delay the Civil War from happening? Our next topic is the crisis deepens. So the crisis gets even worse, and we're going to talk about this woman here. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And in 1852, she published an anti-slavery novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was an incredibly dark story about slave families being torn apart. It's about greed, violence, and the horrors of slavery. This book did two really important things. First, it showed many people outside the South how cruel slavery was. Many Northerners became anti-slavery or against slavery as a result of reading it. Many people didn't know the horrors of slavery. They didn't know how people were treated or families were broken up. So it really was kind of like an awakening for many people in America. Secondly, it really angered Southerners who were upset that they believed that the book, the novel, and the story, it kind of gave a real inaccurate, wrong depiction of how slavery happened in the South. Either way, regardless, this novel is going to be an international seller. It's going to sell not just well in America, but also overseas. It was one of the most read books in the 1800s. It was said to have made the Queen of England at the time cry. Its popularity really changed the discussion about slavery in America and further created division between the North and South. As we talked about earlier, these territories in the West kind of were open to slavery. They could vote on whether or not they wanted to be slave or free states. They called this popular sovereignty, the idea that the people could vote to determine their slavery. That was issued under what was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law basically wrote that people living in the territories could decide their own fate. So we can see that this map looks just like the map we were just looking at. But what's going to happen is a lot of people who are for slavery are going to move into these territories. A lot of people against slavery are going to move into these territories. And they're going to move there to vote on whether it should be free or slave, and violence is going to erupt. Because of this law, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers started moving into territories, and violence broke out on both sides. In Kansas, each side started shooting and murdering each other over the issue of slavery. This event became known as Bleeding Kansas, and it proved that Americans were willing to kill each other over the issue of slavery. This gentleman here his name is John Brown. He was an abolitionist. He was very much against slavery. He believed that America was a sinful country for having even a single slave, and he dedicated his life to the cause of ending slavery. He was a radical abolitionist in the sense that he believed that the only way that slavery was going to end was through murder and through violence. During Bleeding Kansas, he and his sons were involved. They murdered and hacked several pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. They were involved in the Bleeding Kansas issue. A few years later, he and his sons and his supporters ended up raiding the United States Arsenal in Harper's Ferry. This is where the United States military keeps all its weapons and munitions. Their plan was to steal these weapons and then march south and liberate every slave in the South. They were, of course, stopped very quickly by the American military, and John Brown was executed as a threat to the nation. But either way, you can see in this photograph here, this image, he's depicted with the gun in one hand and the Bible in the other, and he believed that it was God's will to use violence against the ending of slavery. Some people have cited that he and his actions were a huge root cause for the Civil War. So here's our second chunk, guys. How did Uncle Tom's Cabin cause tension over slavery? And how did Western territories add more division between the North and South? This is going to conclude the end of the first video. Video number 2, you can go ahead and click on now.